Hello and welcome to NABA Perspectives, a weekly podcast by the Norwegian-African Business Association, or NABA, where we look at key issues, themes, stories, and trends that are shaping economy, policy, and business across Africa. I'm Lanre Akinola, the head of content at NABA, and this week we're talking about debt. If you follow the news about Africa, one of the consistent themes, one of the dominant themes that you will come across time and time again is the issue of debt. It's difficult to get through the day if you read the news about the continent without some sort of coverage that's talking about a debt problem or looming debt problem on the continent. Now, this is a big topic. It's an issue that has been quite a number of years in the making. I've personally been writing and talking about this since at least 2016. And I would say it's one of the more important issues to understand in terms of the macroeconomic situation, the economic situation in general in Africa, not least because of its adverse effect or the strains it puts on economic development. Now, it's a big topic. There's a lot that could be said about this. We could spend hours on this. We don't have the time for that. There are two things that I'm going to focus on in this discussion. First is to break down and unpack a little bit why it is that Africa seems to be facing a renewed debt problem. Many of us will remember that it isn't that long ago, back in the 1890s, we had a big debt crisis in the region until we had the big write-off of debt in the early 2000s. And it seems that we are kind of heading back into similar territory. So we're going to break down a little bit why that is and why debt is turning out to be so problematic for many African countries. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what, if anything, might be done about it. To kick us off and to explore this question of why African countries having debt problems, let's first set the scene. And this right here, I think, it kind of captures the gravity of the situation. This is, according to the IMF, 21 low-income countries in Africa are in or at risk of debt distress. Now, remember, Africa is 54 countries. So we're talking about close to half the continent being either at risk of debt distress or already being in debt distress. Which begs the question, how did we get here? Some statistics that kind of help us to understand this are: one, external borrowing. So the external debt across sub-Saharan Africa, this is data from the World Bank, more than doubled between 2010 and 2021 from 321 billion to 790 billion. In other words, African governments have been borrowing very heavily. So overall debt has increased quite substantially. At the same time, this is from the IMF, the average debt to GDP ratio has almost doubled from 30% in 2013 and now stood at almost 60% at the end of 2022. So overall, you've had a big surge in borrowing across the continent. And that is, of course, something that you have to keep an eye on. It's something you have to be careful with. Too much debt can lead to problems. And if you see such a rapid increase in borrowing, that suggests that perhaps there's something a little bit unsustainable going on here. However, it's very important to understand that this isn't actually the problem when it comes to Africa. First, on the debt to GDP ratio, while, yes, a doubling in just under a decade of the average debt to GDP ratio is quite a substantial move. In global terms, this is actually pretty modest. And just for comparison, here are some debt to GDP ratios from a few of the developed economies. We have the UK at almost 100% of debt to GDP. We have Japan at 224%, and then we have the US coming in at 741.6%. And yes, that figure is correct. I double checked it because I was slightly surprised when I looked that up myself. So by comparison, a 30 to 60% average debt to GDP ratio is actually pretty modest. And when we go back to the overall borrowing figure, the overall external debt figures for Africa, to contextualize this, I'm going to get an article up on screen here that shows just how modest this actually is. Just a second. Here we go. So this is analysis by the Mo Ibrahim Foundation. And when you look at this pie chart here, this is world region shares of total global public debt. And you can see North America, huge chunk, Asia, largest chunk is in Asia, Europe. Then you have a few smaller ones up here. And right at the top here is Africa at 1.9% of total global debt. Now, that's only slightly higher than Oceania at 1.2%. The reason I pick out this comparison is that Oceania has a population of around 45.5 million people or something there around, while Africa has a population of close to 1.5 billion people. So 1.5 billion people account for less than 2% of global public debt. Yeah. In other words, this is a very small figure. Right? So if debt in Africa in absolute terms is actually quite modest and quite limited, then why do we have a situation where 21 out of 21 low-income countries on the continent are at risk of or in debt distress? And the answer is this. The problem isn't borrowing. There's nothing strange about countries borrowing and even borrowing quite heavily. We just saw those debt to GDP ratios in places like Japan and the US. Borrowing in many ways makes the world go round, and you can have a debate about the wisdom of that and the sustainability of global borrowing. But the point is, there's nothing strange about that. Yeah, governments borrow all the time. It's how they finance public spending. It's how they finance development projects. It's an integral part of how governments are run and how economic development is supported. The real issue that African countries are facing is servicing the debt, i.e., paying it off. And the big problem there is that it's really expensive. Now, that begs the question: why is debt in Africa so expensive? Actually, before we get into that, to illustrate the point, here's another statistic. So in 2023, African countries will pay $68.9 billion in external debt service. To put that into context, total foreign direct investment in 2022, that's according to UNCTAD's World Investment Report, was $45 billion. So the continent is paying more in debt service costs than it's attracting in total foreign direct investment. That gives you an idea of how serious the situation is. So why is the debt so expensive? There are a couple of reasons that help to explain this. And for this, let's go back to this analysis by the Mo Ibrahim Foundation. And what we see here is that African public debts are mainly held by non-African lenders and in foreign currency. So it's a big piece of the puzzle here. We go down to the pie chart, we see that 70% of Africa's public external debt is denominated in US dollars. So that means you borrow in dollars and you pay back in dollars. And if your currency doesn't perform very well against the dollar, if you're contending with a strong dollar, what that basically means is that it's really expensive to pay back. And over the last couple of years in particular, we've seen exactly that. A lot of African currencies have not performed well against the dollar, to put it mildly. Here's one illustration that kind of underlines this. So Ghana cedi in 2022 fell by more than 50% against the dollar in that year. In short, it just means that the stronger the dollar is against your currency, the more expensive the debt becomes. But there's another factor here, which is very important, and in some ways one of the most important aspects to understand when it comes to the debt issue in Africa. And that is that most of the debt is owed to private sector creditors who charge countries higher interest rates. This is very significant. In more than in 2021, more than one third, so more than 40% of Africa's public external debt was owed to the private sector. And we're going to break that down a little bit further. But here's also an important line that points out that after the 2008 financial crisis, private sector lenders made more credit available to Africa in order to obtain higher returns. In other words, they got higher yields by lending to African countries. Yields are not technically the same as interest, but basically it means the interest that African governments pay on the money that they borrow. And this is part of what explains that surge in borrowing that we saw from around 2010 onwards, because a lot of governments started going to the bond market. They started going to the capital markets, and the instrument of choice became the Eurobond. And it became, in the same way that we now are constantly talking about debt. I remember it very well. For much of the 2010s, there was a sort of endless procession of Eurobonds being issued by African governments, right? Like it was going out of fashion. They were borrowing so heavily. It was the first significant opening up of the international capital markets towards sub-Saharan Africa, and a lot of governments took advantage of that. Again, there's nothing inherently wrong with that, but it comes with certain risks. And the main risk for Africa, it turns out, was that the yields are pretty high. So unlike bilateral creditors, such as the Paris Club, or multilateral lenders like the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund, the market lends at significantly higher rates. And depending on your credit rating, and most African governments don't have particularly high credit ratings, the yields you pay, the interest you pay goes up quite significantly. And so that's why a lot of money, when quantitative easing kicked in and interest rates went down in the so-called developed world, a lot of that money flowed to Africa because there was simply more of a return to be made. Right? Nothing inherently wrong with that. But of course, the problem with loans is that you have to pay them back. And if the interest rate is high, the price is heavy. Going back to the Mo Ibrahim analysis here, I think this chart here is quite useful in illustrating how much of the public external debt that is owed by African governments is now in the hands of the private sector. Now, that isn't just significant because it comes with a higher price tag than concessional lending or lending from official creditors and bilateral creditors, but this also represents a significant change in the creditor profile of African countries. So if we go back to the early 2000s, when we had that big round of debt relief, the issue then was essentially negotiating a deal with the Paris Club. So the Paris Club is basically, the advanced economies of the West. And if you could convince them, as in the end they were convinced, to write off the debt, that's it's not an insignificant hurdle, but history has taught us that it is possible to get over that. When you look at this picture, right, this is a very different reality that we're in now. Private sector accounts for the biggest single chunk. Also note at the top here that China has emerged as a very significant lender, and the Paris Club actually accounts for a very small share in bilateral, or a relatively small share in bilateral external debt and private external debt. So that's one of the issues. Now, the debt service payments, just to go back to illustrating and underlining this point, to kind of really hammer it home of how significant this is. Here's one example from Ghana. By the end of 2020, debt servicing was absorbing more than half of the government's total revenue and up to 70% of tax revenues. The last fiscal year in Kenya, debt service costs took up 59% of tax income. Yeah. So you have a situation in which African governments are spending huge amounts of their revenue simply to service to service loans that they have taken out, which has very obvious consequences for public spending on essentials. And I've got a graph here that I think really kind of hammers home the point once and for all. This is from the One campaign, and I think this says it all. So debt service as a share of government spending in 2020 overtook health expenditure across sub-Saharan Africa. So while back in 2009 it was at 3.6%, it's now at over 10.4%, and it's literally outstripping healthcare expenditure, and it's sort of creeping up towards being on a par with education expenditure. You don't need to conduct any complex analysis to see the problem here. What you have is reduced fiscal space, a situation in which governments can't spend on basic things like healthcare, or they're having to make choices in some cases. And we have an example from Kenya. Is it? Yeah, here we go. We have an example from Kenya here where it says that Kenya faces a hard choice between workers or a debt default. Kenya's budget crisis has left its government with a hard choice: delay paying public workers and face widespread unrest, or risk defaulting on its debt. So you can see the serious implications from this debt service problem that African governments have for economic development if you don't do something about it, if you don't meaningfully address the issue. Now, all of this was already a problem before 2020, and I would say sooner or later we would have probably arrived at a similar point to where we are. But the events since then, of course, we had the pandemic, and we had other shocks like Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the war in Ukraine, which has caused all sorts of upheaval in the global economy. Those have basically put fuel onto the fire, and has accelerated the process, accelerated the rate at which the debt service payment issue has become a serious problem for many African countries. Another aspect that has really upped the ante is the end of low interest rates in economies like the US in particular. So we've seen very aggressive rate hikes by the Fed. We're probably not done with it just yet. Yeah, might be dropping off, but we're never going back to where we were a couple of years ago, at least not anytime soon. And if, as an African government, you were already facing difficulties in keeping up with your debt service payments before the events of 2020 and subsequent events, before this round of rate hikes, just imagine the kind of situation that a lot of countries now find themselves in. So what was already expensive has become significantly more expensive. So the main points to understand here is that the issue isn't overall borrowing. That's not the problem Africa has. As illustrated in aggregate terms, in absolute terms, it's a tiny share of what's borrowed globally and what's owed globally. The problem is that African governments, I guess you could say, bought at the peak of the market, and they signed agreements with very high yields. They issued Eurobonds that were already very expensive, have now become arguably unsustainably expensive. And it's already cost a couple of countries a sovereign default. In 2020, Zambia defaulted on its external debt, and in December 2022, Ghana defaulted on its external debt. And when we remind ourselves of the statistic that 21 low-income countries are either at risk of or already in debt distress, and that includes economies like Kenya, you can kind of imagine that there must be quite a few governments out there that are at risk, maybe if not quite on the edge, at risk of a potential sovereign default. which is something that you kind of want to avoid. Actually, sorry, before I move on, one thing to also add in terms of the rate hikes is that one of the consequences of that has been that African governments have not just effectively, but have literally been frozen out of international capital markets. I don't think there's been a single issuance of a Eurobond. I might be wrong about this, but I don't recall a single issuance of a Eurobond this year. And I'm not sure that there even was an issuance of any African Eurobonds in 2022. I know that there were few governments that were planning to issue a Eurobond, but they basically pulled back from the market because the yields that were expected were simply too high. And when you're already sitting on a debt burden that you're struggling to keep up with in terms of service payments, the last thing you want to do is add to that with even higher yield bonds. So now that we've kind of broken that down, here are the key takeaways. The issue isn't the overall debt. The issue is the servicing of that debt. It's too expensive, and a lot of it is owed to private sector creditors. The creditor profile has changed. So we aren't in a situation where you just kind of you just have to convince the Paris Club to forgive the debt. You have to convince global capital to forgive the debt. And I'm going to be blunt about this. That's not going to happen. The private sector is not going to write off your debt. At least I think that is wishful thinking if anyone out there believes that might happen. But all of this raises the obvious question. So what to do? I just said debt cancellation, I think, is completely off the table. There have been some calls, including by some African leaders, for meaningful debt relief or debt write-off or an indefinite moratorium on debt service payments. All of that has basically fallen on deaf ears. And I think for a couple of reasons. One is that there's a degree of fatigue because it's only been 20 years since we had the big debt write-off. And I think it was in 2021, 2022. As a senior official, I think as an assistant secretary of state, he was on a visit to Ethiopia, and he was asked about a new round of debt relief and debt cancellation for Africa. And he literally responded by saying, "Didn't we just do that?" And he said that, I don't think that, we would be too sympathetic to that. And certainly my administration, this was under Donald Trump, wouldn't be too sympathetic towards that. Now, it's not 2021 anymore, but I think that kind of captures the overall sentiment. Secondly, and I think this is actually much more important, is this creditor profile and the reality that you now owe a huge chunk of your debt, the biggest part of your private debt by far. Going back to that chart on the Mo Ibrahim Foundation website, I'll just bring it back up here. Going back to that chart, this is the real problem here. Because the private sector isn't interested in writing off your debt. The private sector isn't interested in debt relief. It's just not how the market works. Now, so what do you do? Well, the debt cancellation off the table, which brings me to the G20 Common Framework. This is the main focal point for efforts to provide something that approaches a meaningful answer, a meaningful solution to this issue of debt in Africa. And more specifically, the G20 Common Framework, this is something that was launched in late 2020. And the idea behind it is to essentially restructure debt owed by African governments in order to make it more sustainable and put them in a position where they can repay it. Now, since launch, it hasn't made much progress, and I think that's being quite polite. Only 4 countries have even applied to for support under the Common Framework, and the IMF itself. Just a second here. The IMF itself, I think this was when exactly was this? Yeah, this was at the end of 2021. Let me just get that up on the screen. I think this captures it well. The IMF here warns that the G20 Common Framework for debt treatments must be stepped up. And And it talks about a more challenging debt outlook in 2022, and implementation so far has been slow. And it's calls for basically stepping things up. So that begs the question: well, what's the holdup? Why has there been so little progress? As I said, only 4 countries so far have applied. All 4, incidentally, are African. They are Chad, Ghana, Zambia, and Ethiopia. And so far, there hasn't been much by way of results in terms of getting these countries from a situation where they're struggling with debt or have defaulted on their sovereign debt to a situation in which they now have a deal where they can manage that debt. And there's been a couple of issues, or 2 of the main issues have been: one, disagreement between official creditors. So that is your multilaterals and your bilateral creditors. And part of the issue there is that you have the emergence of new creditors like China. And they have struggled to come to terms or agree on terms on how exactly to approach this issue of debt restructuring for African countries. Negotiations have been ongoing in the case of Zambia, for example, for 3 years now. It applied in early 2020 for debt relief under the common framework. It still hasn't secured a deal. It's sort of, hit one roadblock after another. There's been moments of sort of optimism and hope where it looked like they might get a deal, but then it something always seems to get in the way. And the other major stumbling block is the private sector, because private creditors are simply not interested in anything that resembles the kind of debt relief that we saw a couple of decades ago. The negotiations with them are extremely difficult. The terms that are necessary to satisfy them to even come to the table and entertain the idea of restructuring debt are they're tough to meet. Let's just put it that way. And this is problematic. One, this is really problematic because the common framework was supposed to basically set the precedent and establish the framework, no pun intended, but to establish the model according to which other countries, not just in Africa, but across the world — Africa isn't the only part of the world that is struggling with debt — it was supposed to set the precedent and establish the model that others could follow. And much of the world, and I imagine many governments in Africa, are keeping a close eye on proceedings in places like Zambia and Ghana, which applied after its default at the end of 2022. And I would say that they are probably not encouraged by what they've seen. And I would not be surprised if there are a lot of countries out there that would like to seek support under the common framework. But even uttering the word restructuring is a massive red flag to the market. And with Africa already being effectively frozen out of capital markets because of the confluence of factors I discussed earlier, the last thing you want to let out there is that you might be at risk of a sovereign default. So I suspect that a lot of governments are holding back in the hope that the common framework will see some meaningful success and some breakthroughs in places like Zambia and Ghana. But so far, the prospects of that happening look pretty slim. And in the instance of Zambia, as I mentioned, they have been at this for 3 years already, which indicates what a difficult and complex process this is likely to be for anyone else. So without some sort of change, some sort of change up, some sort of revamping of the common framework, it's hard to see how this process is suddenly going to, to pick up speed and establish that model that's needed to meaningfully address debt sustainability issues in regions like Africa. Okay, so if the G20 framework is not something we can rely on, what else do you do? I mean, African governments have to keep existing. They have to keep running their countries. They have to keep pushing for investment and economic development. They can't just sit around and hope for some breakthrough in these G20 common framework negotiations. And here there are a few things that are being done, are being looked at. One of them is to increase revenue and cut spending. It's kind of an obvious one. The increased revenue bit is a really obvious one. So most African countries have very low tax to GDP ratios. According to the OECD, The average tax to GDP ratio in sub-Saharan Africa for 2021 was just 15.6%, which is extremely low. My understanding is that according to the OECD, 15% is the minimum required for what they describe as basic state functionality. And so it's the absolute minimum threshold you have to reach to have a functioning state. Never mind being able to meaningfully invest in not just basic services and social services, but to meaningfully invest in economic development or industrial development or infrastructure development. So increasing tax revenues is an obvious way to go. And places like Kenya and Ghana have implemented tax increases implicitly tied to the debt problems that they're having. But that's a very difficult thing to do, especially in a situation where a lot of citizens across the continent are struggling with high inflation, struggling with pretty severe economic conditions as they are. There's going, it's politically, it's a very risky and potentially quite expensive thing to push through. Now, some governments might not have a choice, and they kind of have to go through with it. Kenya is an interesting case in point. In the summer, William Ruto, he's trying to push through tax increases, and that led to mass protests, violent mass protests actually in Kenya, and he's had to sort of put the brakes on those plans a little bit. Another option is to pivot more to concessional lending. Some countries are doing this, including Kenya. This is a very recent headline, just from this week, actually. Kenya says focus of its funding strategy has shifted to concessional loans. So concessional loans are below market rate loans in terms of yields, usually from your multilateral lenders like the IMF and the World Bank and some bilateral partners if you're lucky. But and yes, that makes sense. Absolutely. There's no reason not to do that. But there is a reason that African countries, when the capital markets opened to them during the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, there's a reason they flocked to the private capital markets. And that's because it's just so much more money that you can raise from those markets than concessional loans. If concessional loans were enough to cover your financing needs for economic development, you wouldn't bother, going to the market and borrowing at much higher rates. Yeah? So there's a reason the market exists. There's a reason governments go to the market. So I would say at best, it's a bit of a stopgap. And then another one is reforms. And here we have to turn back to the IMF. They put out an analysis quite recently. Get it up on screen here. How to avoid a debt crisis in sub-Saharan Africa. And it talks about 5 policy actions African governments can take. I'm not going to run through it in detail, but let's just have a look at the headings here. So, number 1, re-anchor fiscal policy through a credible medium-term strategy. 2, undertake fiscal adjustments to bring debt back to safer levels. 3, mobilize more domestic revenue. Already touched on that. 4, strengthen budget institutions to improve the implementation of fiscal plans. 5, get people on board. Anticipate public resistance to reforms. Reforms here most likely meaning cuts to spending, cuts to subsidies, things like fuel subsidies. There's a lot of pressure on governments to slash those. Nigeria has, just in the last few months, gotten rid of a long-standing fuel subsidy. Angola is planning to get rid of its fuel subsidy. There are sound fiscal arguments for that, but it's politically and socially, these are not easy things to sell, and the IMF knows it, hence get people on board. Now, all I'll say about this list of recommendations and advice is, I'm not going to argue with it. It's probably good advice. I'm no economist, but it's probably sound advice. The problem is, these are difficult and in some cases, medium to long-term policy reforms, structural reforms, kind of reforms that would take years to implement. This is not a fix. This is not something that is going to here and now tackle the debt problem. So where does that leave us? Well, the unfortunate reality is that I don't think there's a simple answer to the problem that African governments find themselves in now. The dynamics, as discussed, around the creditor profile, the emergence of the private sector and the role of private creditors in this, the global economic outlook, all of those factors, I think, paint a picture in which we are likely in for things to get worse before they get better. I don't say that, I say that there's nothing sort of happy about saying that or reaching that conclusion. But I think the honest assessment here has to be that we are likely in for a number of difficult years in terms of the fiscal positions of many African countries. And the debt issue is at the heart of that. Now, hopefully that assessment is wrong. Hopefully we see a turnaround in the global economy, which helps to lift up African economies as well. And hopefully, we see a surge in investment that frees up fiscal space, desperately needed fiscal space, to invest not just in basic services, but invest in economic development. Hopefully there's a breakthrough in the G20 common framework, and a model precedent and a model is established, and we see a meaningful, sort of a meaningful drive to sorting this out and getting a lot of these countries back on track. But I wouldn't hold my breath. And on that somber note, I'm going to end the discussion there. We're already up to 35 minutes. As I said, this is a big topic, and we could go on about this ad nauseum. There's so much to discuss here. But for the time being, I hope that was useful or insightful. This is one of the most important issues, I think, that needs to be understood about the macroeconomics and the economic situation of many African countries right now. Dealing with it is a high priority, needs to be a high priority. And let us hope for the best, I suppose. Anyway, that is it for this edition of NABA Perspectives. If you like this video, if you found it useful or insightful, feel free to like, share, subscribe. If you're on YouTube, you know the drill. And if you want to know more about NABA, what we do, if you want to sign up to our weekly newsletter, visit our website at norwegian-african.no. And until next week, thanks for tuning in. And if you watched the whole video, thank you twice. Take care.